The first morning is cold enough to bite your lungs. Picture a long, sloping ridge in southern England, Senlac, just outside Hastings. The grass is slick with autumn damp. A hard wind comes in from the channel. Men stand shoulder to shoulder, trying not to show what their bodies already know. In a few hours, everything that feels permanent might be gone. Now picture a different morning, far away and far later, 3.5 centuries later. A field in Picardy, northern France. Two dark woods press in on either side like closing doors. The rain has turned the soil into heavy clay that clings to boots and hooves. A king kneels in the mud, Henry of England, lowering his forehead to the ground as if the earth itself can lend him steadiness. Two dawns, two armies, two rulers who don't yet know which version of their names history will keep. Savior, usurper, conqueror, cautionary tale. And hanging over both mornings is the same question, one we still ask today, even if we dress it in modern language. Is a nation shaped by destiny or by choices made when fear is loudest? Because long before the first Norman arrow rose into the gray air in the year 1066, England had already lived through a series of endings. The Romans had left the island behind in 410 AD. After that came waves of newcomers from across the sea, settlers, raiders, kings, each one changing the land, each one claiming a right to it. Over time, the Anglo-Saxons rose and divided the island into powerful kingdoms. Then the Vikings arrived, fast and brutal, striking the coasts, testing every weakness. England survived those storms, sometimes by fighting, sometimes by bargaining, sometimes by sheer stubborn endurance. So by the time the story reaches 1066, England is not naive about power. It understands that rule can shift, that loyalty can break, that the sea doesn't just bring trade, it brings contenders. And then the moment arrives that makes everything unstable again. King Edward, later called the Confessor, dies in January without a child to inherit his crown. In a world without clear succession, a throne becomes less a seat and more a spark dropped into dry grass. Harold Godwinson takes the crown quickly, publicly, backed by the leading men of the realm. He is not born a king, but he is the strongest pillar holding England upright. He knows the roads, he knows the earls, he knows how quickly order can collapse if leadership hesitates. Across the channel, William, Duke of Normandy, hears the news, and something in him hardens. Because William believes the crown was promised to him, promised by Edward, promised by legitimacy, promised in William's mind by God, and crucially, promised by Harold himself. That one detail, the question of an oath, matters more than it might sound to a modern ear. In that age, a sworn promise isn't just personal, it's political architecture. It holds claims up, it holds alliances together, it protects reputations. And if someone breaks it, the break doesn't stay private, it spreads, it becomes a reason, a justification, a banner others can rally under. So by the time spring turns to summer in 1066, England isn't simply facing one rival claim, it's facing a clash of legitimacy, two competing stories about who has the right to rule. Harold's story says, "The realm chose me, stability demanded it, I was there, capable, accepted." William's story says, "It was promised to me, it was sworn, it is mine by right." And history rarely allows two kings to exist without asking for payment. Now step back for a moment, because Hastings is only the beginning of a longer chain. Centuries later, another English king will stand in another field, Henry V at Agincourt, and he will be fighting in France for a reason that begins, in a very real sense, with William's victory. After 1066, England and Normandy become bound together, not just by marriage and titles, but by land and law. English kings become major players on the continent. They hold territory in France, they owe feudal obligations, they argue with French kings not as distant foreigners, but as neighbors tangled in the same system. That's the hinge. One conquest on an English ridge helps create centuries of cross-channel entanglement. So when Henry kneels in the mud at Agincourt in 1415, he isn't inventing a conflict out of thin air, he's inheriting it, he's walking into consequences that began long before he was born. Which means these two mornings, Senlac and Agincourt, aren't separate stories, they're echoes. But before the echo can exist, the original sound has to happen, and in 1066, Harold is pushed into a year that feels almost impossible. Because William isn't the only threat. To the north, Harold faces another contender, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, a powerful warrior king in the old Viking style, drawn to England like iron to a magnet,
and alongside him is Harold's own brother Tostig, exiled, bitter, hungry for revenge. For Harold, it's a nightmare no ruler wants, enemies outside the realm and fracture inside it, all at once. He marches north, he meets that threat at Stamford Bridge, he wins. But victory has a cost that modern audiences understand very well: readiness. A battle can be won and still weaken the winner, draining trained men, draining supplies, draining time. The best fighters can't simply be replaced like numbers in a ledger, and exhaustion is real. It changes posture, it changes reaction time, it changes judgment. Then, just days after Stamford Bridge, the wind shifts in the channel. William sails. He lands in the south at Pevensey and fortifies near Hastings. He moves with the speed of a man who knows that the first days on hostile soil matter most. He secures food, he builds defenses, he keeps his coalition together, Normans, Bretons, Flemings, and others, each with their own ambitions, all held in place by William's authority and the promise of reward. And Harold, hearing the news, turns his army south again. Try to imagine what that means. Men already bruised and tired, pushed into another forced march, knowing they are going to meet a fresh enemy who has had time to prepare. Harold still chooses to fight quickly rather than delay. From a modern strategic viewpoint, it's not reckless. Delay can be deadly too. Delay allows an invader to dig in, to raid, to recruit, to frighten local communities into compliance. Harold's England is modern nation-state with permanent institutions that keep running while the leader waits. It's a web of personal loyalty, and webs loosen when they're shaken too long. So Harold seeks a decisive moment. He chooses high ground at Senlac Ridge, blocking the road to London. He forms the only defensive structure that has held the island together through generations of warfare, the shield wall, dense, disciplined, stubborn. His plan is simple in the best way: make Dean the Agincourt come up, break his momentum, let the slope and the wall do the work, make the enemy pay for every step. William sees the ridge and knows it's a locked door. And the night before Hastings carries a strange kind of electricity. In William's camp, fires glitter like low stars, priests move between tents. William holds a papal banner, support from Rome, which turns his invasion into something that can be sold as justice, not just ambition. Whether that blessing is purely spiritual or deeply political, the effect is powerful. It pulls men to William's cause and quiets doubts. In Harold's camp, there is less comfort. His story isn't expanding, it's narrowing. He is defending, not advancing. And every defender knows the pressure of a single truth: if you lose once, you lose everything. Chroniclers later talk about signs and omens. The Bayeux Tapestry shows a comet earlier that year, Halley's Comet, stitched above anxious faces like a spear of light. A modern mind doesn't need to believe the sky chose sides, but it should take the belief seriously, because belief changes behavior. A man who thinks God has chosen him can take risks others won't. A man who fears divine judgment can hurry, cling to pride, or misread the moment. Omens aren't scientific evidence, but they're psychological reality, and war is full of psychological reality. So at dawn on the 14th of October, 1066, the two armies face each other with more than weapons. They bring competing versions of legitimacy.
Harold is usually painted in extremes. In one version of the story, he's the last great defender of England, steady, patriotic, almost fated. In another, he's simply the oathbreaker who took what wasn't his and paid for it. Neither version is clean enough to be true. If you want to understand Harold Godwinson, you have to step into the world he lived in, a world where leadership wasn't a job description. It was a constant test of nerve, alliances, and timing, and where the state wasn't a machine that kept running on its own. It was a network of people, relationships, and promises. If those relationships snapped, everything snapped. Harold was born into the most powerful family in England that wasn't royal. His father, Godwin of Wessex, rose with sharp instincts through the reigns of Danish kings and English courts. Harold grew up watching how quickly fortunes could change, how a smile could hide a threat, and how loyalty could be bought, broken, or demanded. When Edward the Confessor became king in the early 1100s, he brought Normandy with him in more ways than one. Edward had spent years in exile across the Channel, and he trusted Norman advisors. But he also needed English muscle, real military backing to keep the realm stable, and that meant he needed the Godwin family. So England's government became a balancing act. Edward had the crown, but the Godwins had enormous influence, land, and men. It was an uneasy partnership, two forces holding each other up while quietly competing for control of the future. Harold rose through this world not just as a soldier, but as a manager of crises. In modern terms, he functioned like a national security chief and chief minister combined. He negotiated with other powerful earls, dealt with rebellions, moved forces, and kept pressure off the coasts. He became Earl of Wessex after his father's death, and from then on he was essentially the strongest figure in the kingdom after the king himself. But Harold's story can't be told without the journey to Normandy, the episode that later becomes the moral centerpiece of the Norman version of events. According to Norman writers, Harold went to Normandy and swore an oath to support William's claim to the English throne. The Bayeux Tapestry famously shows Harold with his hands on holy relics, making a promise that, in that age, carried terrifying spiritual weight. The problem for us today is that the people who preserved this story were often writing under the shadow of William's victory. They had every reason to frame Harold as a man who broke faith and William as a ruler enforcing justice rather than launching a conquest. That doesn't mean nothing happened. Something clearly did, but it does mean we should be careful with certainty. Harold may have been pressured, the terms may have been different, the oath may have been presented later in the most useful way for Norman legitimacy. History here is not a camera recording events, it's a courtroom argument made after the verdict. Still, whatever the precise details, one thing is clear. William believed Harold had promised him England, and Harold understood that William would not let the matter die quietly. Then the decisive moment arrives. In January of 1066, King Edward dies without a direct heir. In a modern system, a constitution would define the succession. In 11th century England, the reality was more practical and more dangerous. Power could pass by blood, but it could also pass by acceptance. The Witan, England's council of leading men, played a role in confirming a king because the kingdom needed a ruler who could function immediately. Harold was there. Harold was capable. Harold already had the loyalty of many in the south, and in the days after Edward's death, the Witan chose him. Harold claimed Edward named him as successor on his deathbed. Again, we can't verify that the way we'd verify modern records, but we can understand the political logic. A fast, stable succession prevents opportunists from tearing a country apart before the crown has even settled on someone's head. So Harold took the crown, and instantly the map of danger lit up, because the throne wasn't just a symbol, it was a magnet. To the south, William of Normandy began preparing an invasion. Ships, horses, allies, papal backing. To the north, another threat was forming, and it was cruelly personal. Harold's own brother, Tostig, exiled and furious, was looking for a way back into power. And then came the biggest northern shock of all. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, an old-style sea king with a brutal reputation and a very old claim to England. Hardrada didn't need to prove he belonged. He believed he could take what he wanted. That was his legitimacy. This is where Harold's year becomes a case study in what modern strategists call decision compression. Too many crises arriving too quickly, forcing choices without enough time, rest, or information. Harold had one main army. He could not be everywhere. If he stayed in the south waiting for William, the north could fracture under Hardrada. If he marched north, he risked leaving the south exposed to a Norman landing. He gambled. Harold marched north with remarkable speed and met Hardrada at Stamford Bridge in late September. The English victory was decisive. Hardrada was killed and Tostig with him. It was the last great Viking threat to England. But victory took a price that doesn't show up neatly in heroic retellings. It took time, it took supplies, it took trained men, especially the housecarls, Harold's professional warriors, and perhaps most dangerously, it cost freshness. The army had marched hard and fought hard. In modern military terms, Harold had spent readiness. And then, just days after Stamford Bridge, the wind changed in the channel. William landed in the south. Now Harold faced a second forced march, this time from the north back down toward the coast. Imagine what that means physically. Sore feet, bruised shoulders under heavy gear, men who had already emptied themselves once being asked to do it again, immediately. Harold still chose to meet William quickly. Why not delay, gather more men, and let the enemy tire? Because delay also costs. Delay invites desertion from temporary levies. Delay gives the invader time to fortify and terrorize the country into compliance. And in a system built on personal loyalty, fear spreads fast. Harold needed a decisive moment before his web of support loosened. So he picked his ground. Near Hastings, Harold took position on a ridge, Senlac, blocking the road to London. He formed a shield wall, a dense barrier of overlapping round shields. His housecarls, disciplined professionals, held the center. The Fyrd, local levies with mixed experience, filled the line and anchored the flanks. From a modern viewpoint, it's a sound defensive choice. High ground steals speed from cavalry. A tight ridge limits flanking. A cohesive formation can neutralize some advantages in weapons and horses. Harold's plan was to make William come uphill, break the momentum, and force the Normans into a long, exhausting contest. But strategy is never only about terrain and formations. It's also about emotion, rumor, pride, panic. The moment soldiers believe the enemy is retreating, discipline becomes fragile. And once discipline breaks, a defensive system becomes vulnerable because it's easier to hold a line than it is to rebuild it after it's been stretched apart. Harold knew that. William knew it too. And this is the human reality at the heart of Harold's story. He wasn't simply fighting for a crown. He was fighting to keep a fragile realm intact against threats arriving like waves. When dawn rose on the 14th of October 1066, Harold stood on that ridge as both a king and an anchor, trying to hold England together by force of will and formation. Below him, William's army waited with its own story of legitimacy, its own sense of destiny, and its own confidence that history was on the move. And in the cold wind above Senlac, Harold's decisions, made under impossible pressure, were about to be tested in the only way that mattered in that age, not by debate, not by documents, but by whether a shield wall could hold long enough for a kingdom to remain itself. William of Normandy grew up with a word pressed against him like a blade. Bastard. Not a private insult, not a childish tease, an identity his rivals used as permission. In 11th century Normandy, legitimacy wasn't a philosophical question, it was a survival question. If your birth could be doubted, your right to rule could be doubted, And if your right to rule could be doubted, men with swords would start imagining the world without you. So William learned early what danger feels like when it lives in the same room. He became Duke of Normandy as a boy, around the mid-1030s, and the years that followed were not a gentle apprenticeship. They were a gauntlet. Plots, usurpers, factions that shifted like weather, allies who smiled and calculated at the same time. More than once, William's life was in immediate danger, and every time he survived, something in him hardened into shape. It's tempting to think of medieval leaders as driven purely by glory, but William's engine was different. He was not sentimental about risk. He did not believe conflict could be wished away. He didn't confuse peace with safety. He treated power the way a fortress treats wind, something you must be built to resist, or it will wear you down. That's why, years later, when he heard that Harold Godwinson had taken the English crown, William didn't react like a man receiving bad news. He reacted like a man hearing the world had violated its own rules. Because William believed England had been promised to him by Edward the Confessor, by right, and, in his mind, by Harold himself. That belief mattered as much as any army, because it gave William something every successful conqueror needs before he ever steps onto a ship, a story strong enough to recruit men, money, and time. And William understood something that still applies in modern politics. Legitimacy is currency, not just popularity, not just fear. Legitimacy, the ability to say, I am meant to lead, and have others repeat it until it becomes reality. So William set about turning his claim into something that could not be ignored. He did it the way effective leaders often do, by fighting on multiple fronts before the first soldier even marched. He built a legal case. Messages moved across courts and churches. His supporters repeated a simple argument. Harold had sworn. Harold had broken faith. William was the rightful successor. It was propaganda, yes, but it was also strategy. If you frame your enemy as unlawful, your own violence becomes correction. You turn invasion into enforcement. Then William secured something even more powerful than law, religious sanction. He sought support from Rome, and he received it. A papal banner under Pope Alexander II. In an age where the sacred and the political were fused together, that banner was not just cloth, it was permission. It signaled that this campaign could be described as just and righteous, not merely ambitious. And when men believed a cause was blessed, they endured hardships they might otherwise refuse. But belief alone doesn't cross a sea. Logistics does. An invasion force is not a speech. It's timber and rope. It's fodder and arrows. It's ships big enough to carry horses and discipline strong enough to keep a coalition from falling apart at the worst moment. William's army was not purely Norman. It was a gathering of many peoples, Norman lords who owed him service, and others drawn by payment, opportunity, and the chance to attach themselves to a rising star. Bretons, Flemings, adventurers whose loyalty was real but conditional. Coalition armies are powerful and fragile. They win when leadership is clear, and they fracture when doubt spreads. And doubt did spread. The fleet waited on the coast. The weather turned against William. Days passed, then more days. Men began to murmur. Some deserted. Some whispered that God was refusing the crossing. This is where William's personality truly matters. He did not surrender to atmosphere. He managed it. The chroniclers suggest he hid the full scale of losses and setbacks, controlled what his men saw, controlled what they believed. That might sound cynical, but it reveals a truth leaders still face. Morale is a resource, and once it collapses, it's difficult to rebuild. William kept his army together long enough for the Channel winds to change. When they did, he moved with urgency, because delay is the enemy of momentum. He gave instructions that reveal his discipline. The fleet should maintain cohesion, wait for signals, avoid scattering into the sea like leaves. Then the sails filled, and the Channel, which had been a barrier, became a road. When William landed at Pevensey, he did not rush inland like a man drunk on destiny. He secured the shore. He protected his supply line. He built fortifications quickly. A prefabricated timber stronghold could rise in a shockingly short time when men were trained to do it, and William's force had that kind of practical organization. This is the part that often gets lost in romantic retellings. The most dangerous days of any invasion are the first, before the invader is entrenched, before local fear does his recruiting for him, before he can feed himself reliably. William understood that, so he made a foothold immediately and made it hard to remove. In the camp, priests moved among the tents, captains met by firelight, horses stamped and snorted in the cold.
William's half-brothers, Odo and Robert, were close, not just his family but his pillars of command, and above it all hung the papal banner, guarded like a sacred key. That night was loud with confidence, but William, if we're honest, would not have been comforted by noise. He would have been looking for cracks. Because he also knew something else. Harold was coming, and Harold, despite exhaustion, would likely choose ground carefully. Harold would likely form a defensive line. Harold's men, especially the housecarls, could hold with stubborn discipline. A shield wall and a ridge is not a puzzle you solve with courage alone. So at dawn, when William mounted his horse and looked up towards Senlac Ridge, he did not see a single enemy line. He saw a locked door. He had a plan: archers, infantry, cavalry, a sequence designed to break structure. But a plan is only a map. The land, the weather, and the human mind always redraw it. From below the ridge, William could see the Saxon standards and the tight band of shields. He could see the road to London behind them. He could feel, as any commander can feel, the pressure of a single day. If he failed here, his coalition might dissolve. His men might decide the sea was safer than a second attempt. In that moment, William's greatest weapon wasn't his cavalry or his banner. It was his refusal to bend. He had survived Normandy by meeting threats head-on, by outlasting doubt, by turning instability into a reason for stricter control. And now he intended to apply that same method to England. Because to William, this wasn't merely a battle for land. It was a battle for the right to define reality. On the ridge, Harold's story said, "This is our realm, we choose our king." In the valley, William's story said, "What was promised must be delivered." Two versions of legitimacy, two futures, two myths competing for the same crown. And as the mist drifted...
From Harold's position on Senlac Ridge, the world has been reduced to something brutally simple. A slope, a road, a wall of shields. Behind him lies the route to London and the fragile idea of continuity. In front of him, down in the misted valley, stands William's coalition, Normans, Bretons, Flemings, men who have crossed a sea to force a claim into reality. Harold has chosen the ground wall. The ridge is high enough to drain speed from cavalry, tight enough to limit flanking. The damp grass is slick, the air cold, and the wind off the channel cuts through wool and mail. His men stand in depth, the housecarls, professional warriors, anchoring the center, the furred filling the line, thousands of shoulders pressed close behind round shields. Harold is more than king this morning. He is the anchor holding that line together. Down below, William studies the ridge like a locked door. He knows he can't simply throw men at it and hope courage does the work. He needs sequence, pressure, and timing, each part feeding the next. So the battle begins the way William intends, with archers. The first arrows rise into gray air and hiss toward the crest. Some strike shields and skitter away. Some embed in wood with dull, ugly thuds. A few find gaps, but the shield wall absorbs most of the shock, because a shield wall is not one shield, it's an agreement among hundreds of men to behave as one body. From a modern viewpoint, this is the first reminder that weapons rarely decide battles alone. Formations do. Discipline does. The difference between chaos and a system can be the difference between survival and collapse. William's archers do not break the ridge, so he commits the next layer. Infantry begin to climb. You can imagine their boots slipping in wet grass, men hauling themselves upward under the weight of mail and gear. They reach the crest and collide with Harold's wall, and discover what Harold's veterans already know. Close cohesion is its own kind of power. The ridge becomes a grinding test, not a single heroic moment, but 100 small ones. Men stepping in to replace exhausted comrades, hands tightening on spear shafts, shields shifting a few inches to close a gap before it can widen. The air fills with shouting and the hard clatter of impacts. The ground becomes churned and slick. Harold stays behind the line, walking the crest, touching shoulders, steadying nerves. It's a kind of leadership that looks small from afar, but matters enormously up close. The reassurance that the king is still there, still watching, still holding the center. For a time, it works. The line holds. William sees that infantry alone won't open this door, so he sends up the cavalry. Norman riders urge their horses uphill, but the slope steals momentum. The ground breaks perfect formations. Horses hesitate where men would not. The shield wall is dense and stubborn, and for a time even mounted force cannot push through. The ridge does what Harold bought it to do. It punishes speed and concentrates defense. If the battle ended here, William's invasion might have collapsed into retreat. And then, something changes. Not because of a brilliant new weapon, but because of a very old human weakness, the temptation to believe the enemy is fleeing. On William's left, Breton units begin to fall back. Whether the movement begins as panic, confusion, or simply the natural recoil of a line under stress, the effect is the same. A retreat becomes visible, and once retreat is visible, rumor moves faster than command.
William is dead. That sentence, true or false, runs through the Norman ranks like a crack through ice. And on Harold's right flank, some Englishmen see the retreat and feel the surge of certainty. This is the moment. The enemy is breaking. Finish it. They leave the shield wall to pursue downhill. From a modern perspective, this is the classic failure point of defensive warfare. A tight formation is hard to break from the outside, but it can be weakened from within. When discipline gives way to momentum, it's easy to hold a line. It's far harder to regain one once it's been loosened. Harold sees the danger. He signals. He tries to pull men back. But in war, timing is unforgiving. Once bodies have started moving downhill, pride and adrenaline carry them further than orders can reach. William, meanwhile, does what defines him as a commander. He rides directly to the point of wavering. He lifts his helmet so men can see his face. He shouts that he is alive. It's not just courage, it's psychology. William understands that armies do not only fight with weapons, they fight with belief. And belief is fragile when leaders vanish, so he becomes visible, unmistakable, a living anchor for his own line. The retreat stops. Then it becomes something else. Norman cavalry turns and counters the exposed pursuers. Englishmen who left the ridge find themselves in open ground without the protection of the shield wall. They try to reform into smaller groups. They raise shields. They attempt to hold, but they are isolated now, and isolation is fatal on a battlefield where mass and momentum decide the moment. Few return to Harold's line. On the ridge, Harold watches the cost of a single impulse. His wall still holds in the center, but part of its structure has been torn away, and structure is everything. The battle grinds on into the middle hours. Neither side can simply stop. Neither side can easily disengage. Men on both sides are exhausted, arms heavy, breath burning in cold air, and now both commanders are learning in real time. Harold learns that holding is not enough if parts of the line can be lured away. William learns that the shield wall can be thinned if the English can be made to break their own discipline. This is where Hastings shifts from brute force to adaptation. William begins to exploit retreats, some unplanned, some controlled, some deliberately performed. Each time a portion of the English line moves out to chase, it is exposed. Each time exposed men are met in open ground, fewer return. Bit by bit, the ridge's strength is drained. And then the final phase arrives, the phase that history will remember in images stitched into cloth. The archers begin to change their shooting. Instead of driving arrows straight into shields, they angle higher, sending shafts to fall beyond the wall, into the less protected rear and flanks. Not a magical solution, but a practical one. If a barrier blocks direct fire, you arc over it. Meanwhile, infantry and cavalry press again, looking for openings that were not there hours before. Near Harold's standard, the fighting becomes dense and suffocating. His personal guard tightens around him. The banner whips in the wind, a symbol that keeps men oriented even when everything else becomes confusion. What happens to Harold in the final moments is still debated. The Bayeux tapestry shows a figure struck in the eye by an arrow, near the words, "Here King Harold is killed." Many scholars believe the image compresses events, representing more than one injury, more than one blow. In reality, Harold likely fell amid the final collapse near his standard, wounded, overwhelmed, finished as the Norman advance broke into the heart of the line. However it happened, the effect was immediate. Because when a king falls, the story of a battle changes instantly. The English do not all stop fighting at once. Many hold on fiercely, but morale is a living thing, and it breathes through symbols. A standard without a king becomes a question no one can answer fast enough. The cohesion that held the ridge together begins to loosen. Some groups withdraw, some stumble back in uneven.
William didn't sleep like other men after Hastings, not because victory felt like peace, but because victory opened a long corridor of problems. A battle could give him a field. It could not, by itself, give him England. In the weeks that followed, he moved like a man laying iron across wet ground. He didn't simply rush at London and hope fear would do the work. He chose routes that pressured the powerful, bent around resistance when it was wiser to bend, and demanded oaths where oaths could hold. In modern terms, William understood something every strategist learns sooner or later. The hardest part isn't taking territory. The hardest part is turning territory into a system that obeys. By Christmas Day, he placed the crown on his head at Westminster. It was a sacred ceremony, yes, but it was also a message, not just to England, but to the continent. The conquest was no longer a campaign, it was a state. And then William did what great conquerors always do if they want to last. He built institutions. He redistributed land to bind men to him. He raised castles, first in timber, then in stone, hard points of control planted across the landscape. He reshaped the church and placed loyal figures in key positions. He gathered information, demanded records, and, late in his reign, commissioned what we now call Doomsday Book, an extraordinary survey completed in the year 1086. It wasn't a story, it was an audit, a king announcing, in effect, "I will know this realm so completely that it becomes governable." From a modern point of view, Doomsday feels almost shockingly contemporary. Data is power. Administration is power. Measurement is power. William didn't just win a battle, he built a machine. But the deepest consequence of Hastings wasn't only inside England, it was across the sea, because William remained Duke of Normandy. that one fact is a fuse. It means the King of England is also a great lord in France, and as a French lord, he exists inside the French king's feudal hierarchy. Imagine that contradiction in modern terms, a head of state who is also, legally, someone else's subordinate. It looks workable on parchment. In reality, it creates permanent friction, two systems of authority competing in the same body. And this is where Harold's shadow remains important. Harold may have fallen near his standard, but he didn't vanish. For Norman writers, he becomes the oathbreaker whose defeat proves divine judgment. For many English people, he becomes the last native king, the man who stood when yet another storm came off the sea. Over time, stories gather around him, as they often do around leaders lost in national rupture. Some legends imagine he survived, others imagine he returned in disguise. We don't have to treat those tales as literal fact to understand their purpose. They are a way for a society to hold on to continuity when political control has shifted. In that sense, myth becomes a kind of resistance. Not a rebellion with weapons, something quieter, a refusal to let memory be tidied away. William understood that too, which is why the Conquest was followed by storytelling as carefully as by governance. The Bayeux Tapestry isn't merely art, it's narrative strategy, an argument in thread and dye that frames William as rightful, Harold as faithless, and the outcome as inevitable. In every age, the winners don't just win the battlefield, they fight for the story people repeat afterward. And because William succeeded, England and France become inseparable in a way they had never been before, not culturally identical, but entangled by titles, land, and inheritance. Now fast forward, the chain tightens. In the year 1154, Henry II is crowned. He inherits England and Normandy, and through inheritance and marriage gains vast territories in France, Anjou, Maine, and most dramatically Aquitaine through Eleanor of Aquitaine. Suddenly, the English crown holds an empire of lands across the Channel that in practice can rival the French king's power on French soil. For the French monarchy, it's intolerable. For the English monarchy, it's inheritance. And for historians, it's a structural trap, overlapping sovereignty that makes conflict feel like correction. Over the centuries, feudal obligations become humiliations. Summons to French courts become political theater. Borders become arguments with Ari standing behind them. The question is no longer who is a vassal. The question becomes who will accept being treated like one. By the year 1337, tensions ignite into what we call the 100 Years' War. Not a single continuous war, but a long era of campaigns, truces, broken agreements, and renewed ambition. King Edward III of England presses a claim to the French crown through his mother. France rejects it, partly on legal grounds, partly because law rarely survives when it threatens power. And the conflict becomes what conflicts often becomes when legitimacy is disputed, a struggle not only of armies but of narratives. This is also where a weapon steps fully into the center of the story, the English longbow. It's easy to talk about the longbow like a magical object, but it wasn't magic. It was a system, a social policy, a lifetime of training. England cultivated archers at scale, and archery became not just a skill but a national resource, one that could be deployed again and again with disciplined consistency. At Crécy in 1346, English forces fight in a defensive formation that maximizes that advantage. At Poitiers in 1356, the pattern repeats. The details vary, but the lesson is clear. Massed confidence and noble pride don't automatically defeat organization and discipline. Sometimes the side that adapts wins, not because it is braver, but because it is smarter about how bravery is used. And yet history has another habit. It teaches lessons that the next generation forgets. Because pride repairs itself, old habits return. Chivalric culture, with all its strengths and blind spots, keeps pulling commanders toward familiar choices. Many in France struggle to adjust fully to what these battles prove, that war is changing, and status alone does not control outcomes. Then, decades later, the story arrives at another king, one who understands legitimacy the way William understood it, and understands narrative the way William practiced it, Henry V. When Henry comes to the English throne in the early 1500s, England is politically delicate. His father took the crown by force, which means the dynasty carries a shadow. Powerful nobles watch him closely. Loyalty isn't guaranteed. Henry needs unity, and he needs a cause that turns restless ambition outward. So he does what rulers have done across centuries. He chooses a foreign war as domestic glue. He revives the English claim in France with precision, demanding recognition, lands, and even the French crown itself. He frames his position as lawful and inherited. From a modern perspective, this is the conversion of history into policy. Claims become tools. Memory becomes leverage. And now you can see how Hastings creates Agincourt. Not as a poetic metaphor, but as a practical chain. William's conquest binds English kings to French lands. French lands create disputes with French kings. Disputes become wars of legitimacy. Wars drive innovations in tactics and training. Those tactics and that training, especially archery, become the backbone of English battlefield identity. So when Henry later kneels in mud at Agincourt, he isn't just fighting a battle in France. He is living inside a world shaped by a Norman duke who crossed the Channel in 1066. One ridge in England becomes centuries of consequences. And the question that hung over Senlac, destiny or decision, still hangs over Henry too. Because in the end, the chain is real, but it's always pulled forward by human choices, by fear, ambition, belief, and the relentless need for legitimacy to be seen, felt, and accepted.
Henry grew up hearing the sound a crown makes when it isn't quite secure. His father, Henry IV, didn't inherit the throne in the smooth, unquestioned way kings like to pretend is normal. He took it, removing Richard II in the year 1399. Whether you call it a deposition or a takeover, the result was the same. The new dynasty carried a shadow, and in medieval politics, a shadow is never just a rumor. It's an invitation for ambitious men to test you. So the young prince, Henry of Monmouth, didn't grow up sheltered by ceremony. He grew up sharpened by instability. He learned early that a king doesn't simply rule. A king is constantly being measured by the nobles around him, by the church, by the people, and by enemies who would love to see him stumble. And Henry wasn't just watching these pressures from a distance. He was shaped by them in the hardest way, through war. In Wales, rebellion threatened the kingdom's grip on its borders. The campaigns were wet, cold, unforgiving. Mountains and narrow valleys, villages that could disappear into mist, raids and counter-raids that tested patience more than glory. Henry fought there, learned there, commanded there. He learned what modern leaders still learn the hard way. Discipline matters more than bravado, and logistics can decide outcomes before swords ever meet. Then came Shrewsbury in the year 1403. Henry was still young, but he was already in the thick of the fight. An arrow struck him in the face, and he survived. The wound became more than a scar. It became a kind of symbol, a prince who had already paid in blood, a man fate had tried to remove and failed to. When Henry became king in 1413, he was only in his mid-20s, but he wasn't inexperienced. He knew how fragile authority could be. He knew that powerful nobles were loyal only as long as loyalty suited them. And he knew that if his reign was to last, he needed more than the right bloodline. He needed a story strong enough to unite the realm. This is where Henry's mind becomes strikingly modern. He understood that internal stability is often built by external focus. If the great lords of England had too much time to argue among themselves, the cracks would widen. But if they were pulled into a single purpose, especially one framed as lawful and righteous, then ambition could be redirected into service. So Henry looked across the Channel, to the long, tangled argument England had inherited since Hastings. English kings with land in France, claims in France, and a century of unresolved legitimacy between two crowns. Henry could have negotiated. He could have been satisfied with reclaiming a few disputed territories, but he chose something bolder, because boldness is also a form of control. He pressed England's claim to the French throne itself. He demanded recognition, land, and a marriage alliance with Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter. The French dismissed his demands. In diplomatic terms, it was an insult. In Henry's terms, it was permission, because now he could say, truthfully enough for his purposes, I offered terms, they refused. I go to war not as an aggressor, but as a rightful claimant enforcing justice. And just like William before him, Henry understood something essential. Legitimacy must be made visible. It must be performed. It must be witnessed. So he prepared. Money from Parliament, support from the church, contracts for soldiers, supplies, horses. Above all, archers, men trained from youth to draw heavy bows and shoot with speed and precision. Not a weapon you improvise, but a national skill cultivated over generations. In the summer of 1415, Henry assembled his invasion fleet around Southampton. The harbor became a moving machine. Ropes, barrels, wagons, arrows, armor, horses. And Henry set strict rules for conduct. This was important. Henry didn't want this campaign to look like a lawless raid. He wanted it to look like kingship. Murder, theft, assault, attacking clergy, these were offenses he declared punishable by death. Not because medieval armies were suddenly gentle, but because Henry understood a strategic truth. Undisciplined violence destroys your own campaign. It creates local resistance, disrupts supply, breaks cohesion, and poisons your political future. When the fleet finally sailed, it was immense, an armada of medieval vessels crossing the Channel under summer skies. The landing near Harfleur was unopposed, and at first the campaign may have felt like it was unfolding exactly as Henry intended. But Harfleur did not surrender quickly. Sieges are not like battles. They are slow, technical, grinding. You don't win a siege by bravery alone. You win it with labor, engineering, and endurance. Henry's men dug trenches, raised earthworks, positioned artillery, early bombards that could batter stone and terrify defenders with thunder and smoke. And yet the French walls held longer than hoped. Worse than the walls was the camp. The ground around Harfleur was marshy, and as the days passed, sanitation broke down. Flies swarmed, disease arrived, dysentery, fever, the invisible enemy that has destroyed more armies than steel ever could. Men weakened, supplies thinned, morale strained. Henry walked among his troops, visible and steady. He shared their hardship where he could. That mattered. In a small army, an energetic leader can keep cohesion alive simply by being seen, but even the best leadership can't fully stop sickness. By late September, Harfleur finally yielded. Henry had taken his foothold. The town could serve as a base. It should have been a moment of relief. Instead, it became a crossroads. Because the French were gathering, multiple contingents were converging into a large field army. Henry's original plan, a quick siege that a fast campaign, was slipping away. He could stay at Harfleur and risk being trapped. He could return to England and accept the political cost of appearing to retreat, or he could do something that seemed almost reckless but had powerful logic behind it. He could march. Henry chose to march north to Calais, English territory on the French coast, an open declaration that he could move through France and survive.
It would be a statement not just to the French but to England's watching nobility. Your king does not flinch. So Henry left Harfleur with a smaller, weakened army, stepping into rain and hostile territory. The march was brutal. The roads turned to mud. Men fell ill. The army moved in disciplined battles, keeping order as best it could, trying to avoid being cut apart by fasting French forces. The key obstacle was the River Somme. Henry needed a crossing, but French forces guarded the fords. Bridges were destroyed or held. Each blocked crossing forced Henry deeper into France, farther from Calais, while a larger enemy moved in the distance like a closing net. From a modern viewpoint, this is where Henry's campaign becomes a survival puzzle. Maneuver, information, timing, morale. He could not win by numbers, he had to win by decisions. And then Henry caught a break. Not a miracle, not magic, just geography and speed. The Somme bends. Henry altered course, moved quickly, and found crossings the French had not sealed in time. His men repaired what they could, and under Henry's personal supervision, the army crossed to the north side. For a brief moment there was rest. But rest in war is never truly rest, because the French were close, very close. Heralds arrived to offer battle as chivalry custom demanded. Henry's response was calm and deliberate. He said, in effect, "We march to Calais. If you disturb us, it will be at your peril." He did not beg for a fight. He did not run from one. He framed the coming battle as the enemy's choice, and therefore the enemy's responsibility. The English marched again. The road ahead was scarred by countless hooves, deep roots in the mud, the physical sign of a massive French host moving into position. Many Englishmen would have looked at those marks and understood what was coming. That night, the English tried to sleep under hedges and in cold fields, while the French camp nearby was noised with confidence. At some point, Henry sent a deputation to negotiate terms, one last attempt to avoid battle. The French, sensing victory, refused any compromise. By dawn, there was no doubt left. Henry's army, exhausted, sick, unoutward, was going to fight, and the place the French chose to block him was a narrow field between woods, where rain had turned earth into glue, a field that would punish speed, compress formations, and reward discipline. Agincourt was waiting. Henry had needed a war to unite his kingdom and secure his legitimacy. Now the war had brought him to a test that would either crown him in legend or break him in mud. And as the pale morning light rose over that narrow corridor of ground, Henry knew something with absolute clarity. The story of his reign would be decided not by what he claimed, but by whether his men could hold when the world finally came down on them.
Henry did not wake on the morning of October 25th, 1415, feeling like a legend. He woke as a man who had marched too far with too little, a man whose army had been thinned by sickness and exhaustion, a king who knew that behind every polished speech about rightful claims, there was a simpler truth. If he failed today, his dynasty could fracture, and England could slip back into doubt. Ahead of him, the French host waited, larger, fresher, confident. Behind him, Calais was still distant enough to feel like a hope rather than a refuge. And between them was a field that looked ordinary until you understood what the rain had done to it. The ground was not simply wet, it was heavy clay, soil that clung like a hand. It grabbed at boots, it stole momentum from men and horses alike. It turned speed into strain. In a fight where so much depended on movement, the earth itself had become a force. Henry looked down that narrow corridor of land and saw what the French did not yet fully appreciate. This battlefield would punish the very thing they trusted most, mass and cavalry, and reward the thing Henry could still offer, discipline and structure. He ordered his army into the formation English commanders had refined over generations. Men-at-arms stood in the center, in solid blocks, steady, armored, built to hold. On the wings were archers, angled forward like the tips of a crescent, ready to fire into any enemy who tried to advance. And in front of those archers, stakes were driven into the ground, simple, sharpened wood, planted to stop horses and to keep the flanks from collapsing. It wasn't romantic. It was engineering. A modern viewer might expect a medieval battle to turn on heroic duels. Agincourt turned on spacing, timing, and terrain. It was, in a very real sense, the design of a trap. But Henry still faced a problem. The French were confident enough to wait. They wanted to attack on their own terms. They believed time belonged to them. Henry could not allow that. He couldn't sit and be stared down. His men were too tired, too hungry, too thinly stretched. If he waited, fear would grow. If he hesitated, the French might tighten the net and force surrender without ever risking their strength. So Henry did something that looks reckless until you see the calculation. He advanced. Not in a wild charge, just a controlled move forward, enough to bring his archers into effective range, enough to force the French to react, enough to communicate without words, "We are not leaving. If you want the day, come and take it." The English halted. The archers drove their stakes into the mud. Bowstrings were checked, kept as dry as possible. Men crossed themselves.
Some kissed the earth. It was a moment of stillness, so tight you can almost hear the sound of breath and rain. Then Henry gave the order. The first arrows rose into the gray air. The French flank cavalry moved to scatter the archers, an old answer to an old problem. But the answer was designed for open ground and firm footing. Here there was little space, and the ground was not firm. Horses stepped forward and immediately began to struggle against clay that pulled at their hooves. The woods on either side limited maneuver. The stake line forced them into bad angles. Riders tried to align and accelerate, but the field refused to give them speed. What should have been a sweeping, controlling movement became a messy, compressed push. And as it faltered, English barrows continued to fall, not as a miracle, but as the steady output of trained men whose bodies knew the work by heart. The French vanguard advanced next, men-at-arms dismounted, heavily equipped, tightly packed. Their courage was not in doubt, but courage cannot lighten steel, and it cannot widen a narrow battlefield. As the vanguard moved, the woods acted like hands pushing it inward. The mud acted like weight. The arrow fire acted like pressure. The French did not stop. They kept coming, but the shape of their advance changed. It became less a wave and more a congestion, an overfull river channeling into too tight a bend. From Henry's viewpoint, the scene would have been both horrifying and clarifying. The French were moving, yes, but not as they intended, not with clean space around them, not with room to adjust, not with the freedom their plan required. Modern warfare has a phrase for something like this, a mobility kill, when you destroy an enemy's ability to move and coordinate, even before their will to fight breaks. Agincourt was a medieval version of that concept. The field and the formation were stripping away French options. When the front ranks finally reached the English men-at-arms, the impact was tremendous. Steel met steel, bodies pressed, breath turned into steam. But what defined this phase wasn't cinematic swordplay, it was compression. The English line was so dense that men in the front could barely lift their weapons. Those behind pushed without seeing. Knights who imagined themselves dueling found themselves locked shoulder to shoulder, forced into short, brutal motions, unable to maneuver. In that crush, a small loss of balance could become disaster. The mud made every step uncertain. The woods made every angle tighter. Henry held the center, visible among his men. He did not hide. He did not vanish into the rear. He stayed where he could be seen, because he understood what leaders in every era eventually learn. In a crisis, people look for a stable point. If the king stands firm, others can stand firm. On the wings, archers continued to fire, and then began to shift roles. As arrows ran low, many moved forward, stepping carefully through the mud, supporting the men-at-arms where the press was heaviest. They were not nobles, they were not glorious in the chivalric sense, but they were decisive, because they were mobile, unencumbered compared to heavily armored opponents, and disciplined enough to act as a single force. Wave after wave of French pressure struggled into the same problem. The corridor did not expand, the mud did not forgive, the woods did not step aside. By the time the fighting began to ebb, the French had suffered catastrophic disruption. Many high-born men were captured, prized not only as political leverage but as wealth, because ransom was a reality of medieval war. And yet Henry's face would not have relaxed, because Agincourt was not just about the center of the field, it was about survival as a whole. He was still deep in enemy territory, he still had to reach safety, and he still had threats behind him. Then came the message that tightened the nut again. His baggage train, his rear, had been attacked by a French force but had arrived too late for the main battle. The attack may have been small compared to the Great Clash, but it mattered, because it brought uncertainty. It brought the possibility of fresh danger, at the exact moment Henry could least afford confusion. And behind Henry's line were prisoners, men who, if freed at the wrong time, could become a threat in a battle that was not yet fully sealed. In that moment, Henry faced the kind of decision that is rarely shown in legend, but often decides whether a victory survives the next hour. Do you protect the future at the cost of moral injury? Do you hold to the customs of ransom and chivalry, or do you remove risk as brutally as possible? Henry's answer would shape not just the rest of the day, but the way history would remember him. Because the glory of Agincourt was real, yet inside that glory was a darker edge, a choice made under fear of renewed collapse. The battle had given Henry a path to legend. Now it was forcing him to decide what price he was willing to pay, to keep that path from closing.
Henry's hardest choices didn't happen in warm halls, with time to think and advisors arguing politely around a table. They happened out on a wet field, with his boots sinking into clay, his men exhausted, and the future balanced on a knife edge. Agincourt had tipped in England's favor, but the battlefield still wasn't fully safe. French forces remained nearby, confusion still moved through the rear, and behind Henry's line were prisoners, high-born captives whose value, in normal circumstances, would be measured in ransoms and political leverage. Then came the message that tightened Henry's chest. His baggage train, his supplies, his wounded, the fragile spine of his army,
had been attacked by a late-arriving French force operating away from the main fight. Maybe the danger was smaller than it sounded. Maybe it was a brief raid. But in the moment, under fog and noise and exhaustion, the size of a threat can be impossible to judge. And uncertainty, in war, is its own enemy. Henry understood the risk immediately. If the battle reignited at the wrong moment, prisoners behind his line could become a second front, not because they were monsters, because they were still men, still capable of grabbing weapons if the chaos allowed it. If French troops broke through to free them, or if English guards were pulled away, Henry could find his rear collapsing when he had the least strength left to respond. So Henry made a decision that still troubles the story of Agincourt. He ordered that many prisoners be put to death, sparing only the most valuable. Even his own men hesitated. Medieval soldiers understood ransom as part of warfare's brutal economy. A captive noble could mean wealth for a lifetime. And beyond money, there was a sense, however inconsistent, that certain rules separated war from pure collapse. That reluctance matters. It tells us Henry's army was not mindless. It tells us there were men who felt the weight of what was being asked. But Henry held to his order. From a modern perspective, this is where the legend of the heroic king becomes complicated by the reality of crisis leadership. Was the threat truly great enough to justify it? Historians still argue about how severe the danger was. What is clear is that Henry believed the risk was real, and he acted to remove uncertainty in the harshest possible way. It's uncomfortable to say, but it's important. Sometimes a victory survives not because it is clean, but because a commander is willing to make decisions that leave scars on the soul. Agincourt itself lasted only a few hours. The consequences lasted centuries. When the field finally quieted, Henry still had to do what every commander must do after a battle: move, regroup, feed men, secure roads, get to safety before the enemy could reorganize. He reached Calais, and from there he returned to England. And this is where Henry's second battle began, the battle for meaning. In London, his arrival became ceremony, processions, banners, prayers. A nation told loudly and repeatedly that God had favored its king. This was not just celebration, it was strategy. Henry understood what William of Normandy had understood centuries earlier. If you control the story, you control what happens next. In a country where powerful nobles watched the crown for weakness, Henry needed Agincourt to become more than a tactical success. He needed it to become proof that his dynasty was legitimate, that England was united behind him, that the future belonged to his rule. So Agincourt grew into a parable. The outnumbered defeating the greater host, discipline defeating confidence, common archers proving decisive where noble pride expected to dominate. It's a story so satisfying it almost tells itself, and that's why it lasted. Later, Shakespeare would turn Henry into a near-mythic figure, giving him words that condense fear into inspiration. And centuries after that, in the First World War, newspapers would print reports, half rumor, half longing, that British soldiers near Mons saw ghostly archers in the air, as if Agincourt itself had returned to protect the nation. That isn't history in the strict sense, but it reveals something true about people. When we're frightened, we reach backward for symbols that reassure us we've survived impossible odds before. Agincourt became one of those symbols. And yet, even as the myth brightened, the political reality continued, complex, strategic, and far from finished. Henry returned to France again. He campaigned with focus and patience, building leverage not only through battles but through sieges, alliances, and pressure on a divided French political landscape. In the year 1420, the Treaty of Troyes recognized Henry as heir and regent of France, and he married Catherine of Valois. For a brief moment, it looked as if he had achieved what generations of English kings had chased, a future where the crowns of England and France might be held together by one line. It was an extraordinary turn, one that made Agincourt feel to many contemporaries like destiny rather than chance. But history has a habit that even the greatest leaders cannot command. It outlasts them. Henry died in 1422, still young, leaving an infant son, Henry VI, at the center of a storm too large for any child and too unstable for any regency to control with certainty. The English position in France, which had depended so heavily on Henry's personal leadership and momentum, began to erode over time. This is the cold lesson beneath the legend. Institutions matter. When a system is weak, even brilliant individuals cannot guarantee a lasting outcome.
So Agincourt became a monument, while Henry's long-term project fractured. And that brings us back to the three central figures of this story and the thread connecting them. Harold, in 1066, represents a political order built on local loyalty, council, and the shield wall, a world where a king had to physically move to hold the realm together. He didn't fall because he lacked courage, he fell because his year compressed too many crises into too little time until even good decisions became exhausting. William represents the new model, continental politics, papal sanction, cavalry integrated with governance, conquest followed by administration. He didn't just win a day, he reshaped a system, and in doing so, he tied England to France in ways that would echo for centuries. Henry inherits that nod. He fights in France not only for land, but for unity at home and legitimacy in the eyes of history. He wins a battle that becomes myth, and then, in the hardest moment, he shows the cost of leadership under fear, how victory can carry a shadow. If you pull back far enough, the pattern becomes clear. These wars were never only about weapons, they were about belief, about who people accepted as rightful, about what story felt true enough to follow, about how rulers turned anxiety into cohesion. And in that sense, the medieval world is not as distant as it looks. The banners are different, the armor is gone, the language has changed, but the questions remain familiar. How a nation holds together under pressure, how leaders earn legitimacy, and what price is paid when survival feels like it's slipping away. Agincourt gave Henry a legend, but it also left behind a warning, quiet, persistent, and modern. Even the most glorious victory can demand choice.
If you stand on Senlac Ridge today, it doesn't announce itself as a turning point. The slope looks almost gentle, the distance feels walkable. The wind moves through grass the same way it must have moved through it in the autumn of 1066. And that's one of history's quiet tricks. It hides its most decisive moments inside landscapes that refuse to perform. But Harold would have felt it in his bones. To him, the ridge wasn't poetic. It was final. Behind it lay the road to London, the fragile spine of the realm, and the need for the kingdom to keep functioning as one piece. Ahead of it stood an invader whose claim was backed by allies, by ambition, and by a story that had been prepared long before the first arrow rose into the sky. Harold is often remembered as either a hero or a villain, either England's last native king or the oathbreaker who got what he deserved. Real life isn't that neat. From a modern point of view, Harold's tragedy wasn't simply defeat. It was what happens when a leader is forced into too many decisions too quickly. In one season, he faced threats from the north, threats from the south, and fracture inside his own political world. He marched, fought, marched again, and tried to hold together a system that depended heavily on personal loyalty and physical presence. Modern governments have layers, institutions that keep running while leaders move. Harold's England had the beginnings of structure, but it was still a web. And webs don't like shock. They loosen, they tear, they sag under pressure. That's why Stamford Bridge mattered. Harold won in the north, but it cost him readiness. It cost him time. It cost him trained men he couldn't replace quickly. So when William landed, Harold arrived at Hastings with an army that had already been asked to give everything once. And when the line on Senlac broke in places, when parts of the shield wall loosened, Harold's battlefield became less about courage and more about structure. A shield wall is not simply wood and iron, it's agreement, discipline, a decision repeated by hundreds of men every second. Stay together. Once that agreement frays, even brave men become vulnerable in open ground. Harold fell near his standard in the final crisis of the day. Exactly how is still debated, and it should be. The Bayeux Tapestry gives us the famous image of an arrow in the eye, but the tapestry is also propaganda, not a neutral photograph. The most honest conclusion is that Harold likely suffered multiple wounds in the collapse around the center and died amid the press of the final advance. But what matters most is what his fall meant. When a king falls, cohesion becomes fragile. Symbols stop working. Men who were holding because the banner was still there suddenly realize the banner is only cloth. The mind begins to slip, not always in panic, sometimes into exhaustion, sometimes into resignation, but the change spreads. Harold lost the field, yet he didn't disappear. Because the conqueror's hardest enemy is not the defeated army, it's memory. To Norman writers, Harold becomes the perjurer, the oathbreaker whose end proves divine judgment. To many English people, he becomes something else, the last king of their own, the final stand before a foreign order settled over the land. And this is where myth begins to do its quiet work. Stories grow around Harold, tales that he survived, that he returned, that he lived on as a pilgrim or a hidden figure.
We don't have to treat those as literal truth to understand why they exist. When a society experiences rupture, it often builds legends to stitch the wound closed. Myth becomes continuity, a way to say, we are still ourselves, even when the crown has changed hands. William understood the power of that, which is why he didn't only conquer with force, he conquered with framing. He backed the story that justified his victory. He benefited from the papal banner, granted under Pope Alexander II, which placed a sacred stamp on his cause. He supported narratives that presented him as rightful and inevitable. And the Bayeux Tapestry, commissioned in his orbit, is part of that effort, a persuasive record designed to make the Norman version of legitimacy feel obvious. From a modern perspective, it's political communications, medieval style, not tweets and headlines, but thread and imagery. And it worked, because humans have always needed stories that make chaos feel orderly. But William's real burden began where the battle ended. Winning a day is one thing, governing a kingdom is another. After Hastings, William had to do what every successful conqueror must do: turn violence into administration, turn fear into compliance, and compliance into something durable. He did it with a system. Land was redistributed. Loyal men were planted in key positions. Castles rose across England, first timber, then stone, less romantic fairy tale towers, and more like hard nodes of control, designed to dominate roads, towns, and regions. The church was reshaped, bringing England more tightly into continental patterns of authority. And then came one of the most revealing acts of his reign, Doomsday Book, completed in the year 1086. Doomsday is extraordinary not because it's dramatic, but because it's modern in spirit. It's data, it's measurement. It's the king saying, I will know this realm in detail, its land, its wealth, its obligations, so that it cannot hide from governance. In a world where power often depended on personal presence, William built a way to make power portable, written record. That is how conquest becomes statecraft. Yet William also created a problem that outlived him, a problem that would echo all the way to Agincourt. Because William remained Duke of Normandy, that single fact tied England permanently to France, not just culturally, but legally and politically. The King of England was also a great lord in France, technically a vassal of the French king for Norman lands. It's a contradiction that looks manageable on parchment and becomes explosive in reality. And it set up centuries of tension. Feudal obligations felt like humiliation, disputes over territory felt like existential threats, and every succession became a potential international crisis. This is the thread that leads forward through generations: English kings holding French lands, French kings trying to reclaim them, and both sides insisting that legitimacy belongs to them. Then, centuries later, Henry V steps into that inheritance. Henry isn't just fighting in France because he wakes up ambitious one morning. He's fighting because the node exists, because Hastings tied England into a continental system of claims. Henry inherits that node, and he uses it. He understands, like William did, that legitimacy isn't only inherited, it's performed, reinforced, and made visible through action. Agincourt becomes Henry's proof. From a modern angle, all three men, Harold, William, and Henry, are wrestling with the same core problem. How do you make people accept your authority when the world is unstable? Harold's answer is rooted in immediate governments, council support, rapid response, defensive cohesion, holding the realm together by presence and necessity. William's answer is a blend of claim and system: promise, oath, papal sanction, then administration, castles, landholding, record-keeping, so rule doesn't depend on a single day's battlefield success. Henry's answer is narrative plus victory: unify a restless political landscape by turning war abroad into legitimacy at home, then amplify the story until it becomes national identity. Different centuries, different armor, same human mechanics. Belief still drives behavior, legitimacy still acts like currency, and stories still shake what people accept as real. So when we look back at Senlac and Agincourt, we're not only looking at old battlefields, we're looking at how nations hold together, or fail to, when pressure arrives from every direction. We're looking at the way leaders are forced to choose, quickly, imperfectly, with costs they may not even fully understand at the moment. And we're looking at a truth that hasn't changed much in 1,000 years. History isn't only what happened. History is what people agreed to remember, and what they needed to believe.
Imagine a quiet room lit by candles. Not a throne room crowded with cheering men, and not a battlefield roaring with panic. Just a private chamber of stone and timber somewhere in medieval Europe. An oak table stands in the center. On it lie the objects that make and break kingdoms: a crown, a wax seal, a rolled parchment map. The air smells faintly of smoke. Banners hang overhead, shifting gently as a draft slips through the shutters. Now imagine 3 shadows entering that room. Harold stands closest to the door, as if he still expects another messenger to arrive with one more emergency. William stands near the center, calm and measuring, like a man who sees everything, land, law, faith, as something that can be arranged into order. And Henry stands near the window, looking out into rain, carrying the weight of a victory that brought glory and left questions that won't stay quiet. If you could ask them one question, just one, maybe it would be this: what did you think you were building? Because for all the armor and banners, for all the speeches and oaths, the truth is that none of them could see the full shape of what their choices would create. Harold would probably answer first, and his answer would sound less like poetry and more like a briefing. He would say he was trying to keep the realm whole. Edward died without a direct heir. The kingdom needed a working ruler immediately. The north was threatened, the south was threatened, and the government was a web of loyalties that could tear apart if the center hesitated. Harold took the crown because someone had to hold the system together before it collapsed into competing warlords. From a modern point of view, that doesn't sound like simple ambition, it sounds like crisis management. And it forces us to see Harold not as a clean villain or a clean hero, but as a man making hard choices under pressure, choices where every option had a cost. Then William would speak, and his answer would be colder, clearer. He would say he was making a claim impossible to ignore. In William's world, a claim that isn't defended becomes a joke. Legitimacy must be seen, it must be enforced, and once he wanted Hastings, he didn't treat victory as the end, he treated it as the beginning of governance. He redistributed land, raised castles, aligned the church, and demanded records. He turned conquest into administration. If William needed one piece of evidence, he could point to Doomsday, an audit of England completed late in his reign. Not myth, not rumor, but data. The king insisting he would know the realm so thoroughly that it could no longer evade control. In a way, William was building something that feels almost modern, a state that could function through systems, not just personality, and that is why he lasted. But William's answer carries a warning too, because his conquest created a long-term entanglement. By remaining Duke of Normandy, he bound English kings to French land and French politics. It's the kind of strategic knot that can take centuries to untie, if it ever truly can be untied at all. Then Henry would speak, and his answer might be the most familiar to us. He would say he needed the nation to believe. Henry came to the throne in a dynasty still shadowed by the way his father took power. He knew that noble loyalty could shift, he knew unity wasn't guaranteed, and he understood, with a clarity that feels startlingly modern, that a great external cause can fuse a divided society, at least for a time. So he marched into France not only to take land, but to produce legitimacy, and at Agincourt he achieved a victory that became a national parable, the outnumbered holding firm, discipline defeating confidence, common archers deciding the fate of princes. That story is so powerful it outlived the war itself. But Henry's reign also shows the cost of myth, because myth polishes, it simplifies, it makes hard decisions look inevitable, and terrible choices look clean. Agincourt became legend, and legend tends to hide the parts of leadership that feel morally complicated, the moments where survival and ethics collide. If we hold a modern mirror up to these men, the reflections are uncomfortable in useful ways. Harold reminds us that leadership in crisis is rarely moral theater. It's often emergency decisions made too fast, with too little rest, under too much uncertainty. Even right choices can fail when the system around you is exhausted. William reminds us that victory isn't governance. If you want power to last, you need administration, information, and infrastructure. But he also reminds us that short-term success can lock a nation into long-term consequences, strategic entanglements that outlive any single reign. And Henry reminds us that narrative is power. A leader who controls the story can stabilize a kingdom, but the story can also become a trap because it tempts future generations to repeat old patterns, believing past glory guarantees future outcomes. Now, if we're honest with history, we also have to be honest about what we can and cannot know. Hastings was decisive, but conquest was a process. William still had to secure England after the Ridge was taken. Harold's famous oath in Normandy comes to us mainly through Norman-friendly sources and a propaganda artwork, the Bayeux Tapestry. Something happened, but the details, how voluntary, how binding, how exactly it was understood, remain debated. And the famous image of Harold being struck in the eye by an arrow is iconic, but it may compress events. Harold likely died in the final chaos near his standard, possibly with multiple wounds. Certainty is out of reach. These uncertainties don't weaken the story, they make it more human, because the past, like the present, is rarely neat. So why do we still tell these stories? Why do Hastings and Agincourt still feel alive? Because they're not only about medieval kings, they're about identity under pressure. Hastings asks a question that still matters. Who owns a country? Bloodline, council, or conquest? What is legitimacy when two stories collide and both insist they are true? Agincourt asks another question we recognize instantly. What does a nation do when it is outnumbered, exhausted, and trapped? When success depends on discipline, terrain, and the ability to hold together while fear tries to pull you apart? And both battles point toward a deeper truth. Belief changes behavior. In 1066, people watched a comet cross the sky and felt the world tilt. In 1415, men kissed the ground before marching into mud, believing that God was close enough to hear them. Today, we may not look to comets for meaning, but we still live by stories, national stories, political stories, personal stories, that shape what we think is possible, what we think is justified, and what we think we can endure. So maybe the mythological layer of these events isn't angels in the clouds. Maybe the myth is inside us, the human need to believe history has order, that sacrifice has purpose, that suffering produces meaning. Now, return to that candlelit room. The crown and the seal sit on the table, the map remains rolled, as if the future is still waiting to be unrolled by someone else. The three shadows stand there, Harold, William, Henry,
each carrying a different version of legitimacy, each convinced he acted for the good of his realm, each leaving behind consequences he could not fully control. And if the room could speak, if stone and wood could speak, it would not declare who was righteous. It would offer something quieter and more useful. History is made when human beings, afraid, ambitious, determined, choose action over uncertainty. Sometimes that choice builds a nation, sometimes it breaks one, and often it does both at once. Because long after the banners fall and the armor rusts, the world keeps moving, down roads built by conquerors, past churches shaped by reform, across fields where men once knelt and swore that this day would decide everything. And in a sense, they were right. Not because fate wrote it in the sky, but because people did.